All right, guys, we are going to read another biography today. This one is called Delivering Justice, W.W. Law and the Fight for Civil Rights. Before reading today, we're just going to talk about some vocabulary that we might need to know. So the first word we're going to talk about is a boycott. A boycott is used as a verb and a noun in this story. The way it's used as a verb, it means when people join others in refusing to do business with a person or organization. So I can say something like, I'm going to boycott going to Walmart because I don't know like how they treat their employees. Another type of boycott is a noun where it's kind of the same thing. It's a plan joining with others and refusing to do business with a person or organization. So I could say something like, we are having a boycott, and that would be used as a noun, versus I am going to boycott, which is a verb. Kind of the same thing, right? Okay. Injustice is a noun that refers to unfairness or something that is not right. Protest, the verb, means to complain or express disapproval against something. And registered is being used as a verb in this story, and it means recorded officially. In the context of this story, people are going to register to vote. So what that means is you go and you kind of tell them who you are and then say, I want to vote. And then they record your name and you're officially on the voter list and you're able to pick the candidate you want. A little historical background. So we had yesterday read about Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and the end of slavery in the United States. So kind of going back to that, the 1860s was a period of great change in the United States. The Civil War started in 1861, and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed freeing slaves. In 1865, the war ended and the 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery. Despite this, former slaves and free African Americans weren't considered citizens of the United States until 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed. And they didn't have the right to vote until 2 years later with the passage of the 15th Amendment. So what we did not learn yesterday in the story about Abraham Lincoln was that there were amendments added to the United States Constitution. An amendment is just like additional laws that you can put with the Constitution. And the Constitution is like the number one law of the land in the United States. Like you cannot do anything if the Constitution says you cannot. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are. So things like freedom of speech are in the Constitution. Freedom of religion is in the Constitution. So once it's in the Constitution, it's like really, really difficult to make it so people can break that law. So the 13th Amendment ended slavery everywhere. So remember, the Emancipation Proclamation only ended slavery in the states that were fighting. The states that were kind of off on the side, not really participating in the Civil War, they still had slavery, so that took that away from them too. However, even though everyone was technically free, they were not considered citizens of the United States until 1868. African Americans were not. So they were just kind of like here, right? And then that was with the 14th Amendment. And then they still couldn't vote. African Americans could not until the passage of the 15th Amendment. So interesting, right? So little by little, African Americans are given rights. Now, even when African Americans were given the right to vote, with the passage of the 15th Amendment, things were not just. There was a lot of injustice going on. Change is hard. Many could not adjust to treating former slaves, people owned like property, as equals. So a lot of people were totally fine with being cruel and keeping slaves. So now that these slaves are free, they've been told, well, now you have to treat them like just the same as yourself. They're totally equal to you. And people were like, what are you talking about? I just owned that guy, right? Even in the northern free states, African Americans often weren't seen as equals. So even people that did not agree with slavery were like, I don't agree with slavery, but I mean, come on, white people are way better than black people. As our country worked through these changes, Jim Crow laws were created, and those are laws to keep African Americans and white Americans separate in southern states. So They started segregation, that idea that white people and black people would go to different schools, they would go to use different drinking fountains, things like that. They call those kinds of laws Jim Crow laws. There was this term called separate but equal, and the Supreme Court even said that, okay, it's totally fine that we do this and we have segregation because everybody has a drinking fountain. Just because we have one for black people and we have one for white people, what's the big deal? Everyone's got a drinking fountain. No one's going to be thirsty. So the Supreme Court in 1898 made segregation legal in a lawsuit called Plessy versus Ferguson. The ruling said that different racial groups could be required to use different public facilities like restrooms, water fountains, schools, entrances, as long as they were equal, as long as everyone had one. They say separate but equal came about as a result of this case. But we all know things were not equal. This idea of segregation and separate but equal had a negative impact. So many white people, like I said before, were resentful of the fact that they had to treat African Americans as equals. And African Americans at the same time realized, so what are you talking about? You're not even treating us equally. Whites who did not treat African Americans kindly were often targets of hate crimes, just like those who were trying to help. Restaurants and movie theaters created separate entrances and seating areas for African Americans if they provided them with service at all. Separate public schools were created for African Americans where students frequently got hand-me-down supplies such as books and desks from white schools. So it's not equal, like the white schools got all this funding, all these new supplies. The black schools got all these hand-me-downs, and the schools that like the facilities weren't equal. The entrances and the seating areas for African Americans in movie theaters, for example, would be a lot less fancy than the white entrance and things like that. You know, and we all know about the bus, how the white people had to got to sit in the front and the blacks had to sit in the back. And if you were a black person and a white person came on and there was no seat, you had to give up and give them your seat. You know, that doesn't sound equal, does it? So in 1954, there was another Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, where someone said, you know what, these schools may be separate, but they are definitely not equal. And the Supreme Court actually agreed at that time. They said, you know what, segregation in school is not a good idea. Let's make it illegal. However, a lot of people resisted that. So they're like, from now on, black people and white people can go to the same school, but a lot of white people were like, no, they will not, and they tried to stop them. So that's a whole other story that is interesting to tell and read. The reason why I'm giving you all this background is because the person we're going to learn about today, W.W. Law, he was someone that during the time of segregation tried to make a difference and tried to use nonviolent means to fight against this injustice that was occurring to African Americans in America. So like I showed you guys yesterday in the Abraham Lincoln story, what I want you to do is I want you to read the question that goes with the page in your own copy of this slideshow. And then I want you to answer the questions down below, okay? So I'm not going to actually type them. I'm going to read the book. I'm going to talk about these questions, but I want you to go back and I want you to fill them in, okay? If you're having trouble seeing the text, then you could always use the zoom button and you could zoom in to read better because you might want to refer back to the text, of course, when you're answering your questions, okay? So the first question is, what does the title page tell us about this text? So all I see is delivering justice, W.W. Law, and the fight for civil rights. So I think this text is going to be about civil rights like we just discussed. I also am noticing in this picture, there's a mailman here. Maybe this is the guy, the main character, right? Why else would they have a picture of a mailman? So 2 questions we're going to think about when we read this page. Does the writing style sound more like an expository text or a narrative? So is it more like a textbook or a story? And what point of view is being used? I'm going to try to zoom a little bit. So when I zoom, that's what happens, right? Okay. Savannah, Georgia, 1932. The smell of his grandma's biscuits lured Wesley to the kitchen. Wesley was excited because today was Thursday, the day he would see his mother. The rest of the week, she worked for a white family just outside Savannah, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of their children. This was her day off. Grandma's old friend, John, was sitting at the table. Wesley loved listening to the old man's stories. Old John had been born a slave. He had been taken from his mother and had never known her name. He was 9, Wesley's age, when he and all the slaves were freed in 1865. Wesley felt lucky. At least he saw his own mama once a week. Easter shopping at Levy's. So one thing I noticed that's going on in the story is Savannah, Georgia, 1932, and then we have a new heading here that kind of separates, shows me that they're going into a different idea or a different setting or maybe passage of time. Once a year, sometime before Easter, Grandma would take Wesley downtown to Levy's department store on Broughton Street to buy one nice outfit. They used the Levy's charge card and then paid a little bit each month. On one shopping trip, the saleswoman would not serve them until after all the white customers had been helped. Wesley had heard the saleswoman politely call the white women customers Miss and Mrs., but she treated his grandma as if she were a child and nobody. Wesley's grandma pretended not to notice. She was polite, but she was also proud. "Come on," she said, "it's time to go home." They left the store without buying a thing. So I think it would have been easy for her to yell at the lady and be like, "You're being so rude to me." But she just was like, "You know what? I'm just not going to spend money here then." That would be difficult to do, I think. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out. So the question, the writing style, one thing I know about biographies is they're supposed to sound like a story, right? So I think this sounds like a story. They're telling us the story about the Easter shopping trip, story about Wesley being excited to spend time with his mother that he only got to see once a week, but it was still better than slavery. So I think part of that is being like, so things were a little bit better, but they weren't equal. They weren't good. This was still not fair, right? The point of view being used, this is a third person story. It's not being told by Wesley. It's not being told by a character. It's being told by an outside narrator. Basically, the author is kind of teaching us all about this guy, Wesley. How does this picture help the reader understand what segregation means? And how does the text help the reader understand what segregation means? Let's go ahead and read the text, and then we'll answer these two questions. Segregation is the heading. Back then, Black people weren't treated as well as white people. Most of the time, they were kept segregated from whites. Wesley went to a separate school for Black children. He had to drink from water fountains marked colored. He could not sit and eat at the Levy's lunch counter. So for the picture, it clearly shows the two drinking fountains, one labeled colored and one labeled white. So that kind of helps me understand segregation means they have to use different water fountains, right? I noticed like Wesley, there's a boy here. I don't know who that is Wesley or whatever, but this boy is waiting to use this one. He can't use this one. No one's using it, but he can't use it because it says white. So he's waiting in line to use this one. It's kind of interesting, right? How does the text help us understand what segregation means? Well, it says in the text here, Wesley went to a separate school and he had to drink from water fountains marked colored, and he could not sit at the lunch counter. So like he couldn't go to the restaurant basically and have lunch there. So those ideas help me understand that segregation means that there was separation if you were Black and white. On this page, we're going to think about how the author uses foreshadowing. And then we're going to reread the last paragraph on page 223 and think about what Wesley's role was in voter registration. So before I read, foreshadowing is when the author gives us clues about what will happen. So let's read page 222 and think about what clues the author might give us about the future. The heading is his grandma's prayers. Sometimes Wesley got angry that Black people were mistreated and that no matter how hard his mother worked, they were still poor. But his grandma was always there to talk with him. She understood why he was upset, but she didn't want him to have bad feelings about himself. She said that no matter how he was treated, he had no excuse not to be somebody. She told him again how the day he was born, she said, "I got on my knees and prayed that you would grow up to be a leader of our people." Wesley promised himself that he would fulfill his grandma's prayers. He also promised himself that he would work hard so that one day his mother would not have to work in someone else's house. So let's think about that first question and foreshadowing. What kind of clues are we getting about what's going to happen in the future? To me, it looks like his grandma's prayers. You would grow up to be a leader of our people. And Wesley promised that he would fulfill his grandma's prayer. So, I mean, there's also a biography written about the guy, so clearly he did something good. But I think that is telling me that he is going to do that. He's going to be a leader. He's going to be a good role model and help people in these situations. So that would be my question for my answer for question number 1. Let's go over here, and the heading on page 223 is Voter Schools, 1942. So time passed again. Wesley knew that many Black people didn't vote because they had to pass a test to register. The test was designed to be difficult for Black folk to pass. It was intended to keep them from voting. So Black people got the chance to vote, we talked about in the beginning. However, there were many ways that white people tried to keep them from being able to actually do that. And one of the ways they did that was make some ridiculous test. And there'd be questions on it like, you need to, like, how many stars are in the sky? Something like totally ridiculous and impossible. And the only people that had to pass this test were Black people. Wesley was a member of the Youth Council of the NAACP and the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. The Youth Council started a special voter school in the basement of his church. With his friend Clifford, Wesley talked to everyone, even passersby, about voting. When he found someone who, scared by the test, had never registered to vote, he took them to the voter school. When they felt ready to take the test, Wesley went with them to the courthouse and stayed until they were registered. With Wesley's help and encouragement, many Black people in Savannah became registered voters. So basically what's going on is people were like, I don't want to register to vote because they're going to make me take this test that's going to be really hard. So he's like, no, I'll help you. I'll help you register. I'll help you get past this barrier of this silly test. And we're going to get you registered so that you can vote, like is your legal right to do so. Oops, sorry. So here is a voter registry, people standing in line. Here's Wesley kind of helping people get in that line, get in there and register, right? It says reread the last paragraph on page 223. What was his role? We just discussed that. I would say Wesley set up a voter school and he helped people register. He helped people not be afraid of the test they had to take. And he got more and more people, more and more African Americans registered so that they could vote. What do Wesley's actions tell the reader about his character? So let's read these 2 pages and think, what do we learn about Wesley and what kind of guy he is? Working as a mailman, 1949. After college and the Army, Wesley wanted to be a teacher, but because of his membership in the NAACP, no one in Savannah would hire him. So Wesley became a mailman. The Postal Service hired qualified people regardless of their color. As it turned out, this job suited Wesley just fine. Good morning, Miss Sally Lawrence Jenkins, Wesley sang out to a young woman in her garden. Here's a letter from your sister. Wesley liked to address people by their full names. He could trace a person's history in their name. And history was important to Wesley. If you don't know where you've been, how do you know where you're going? He loved to ask. So he sounds like a friendly guy. We're thinking about Wesley's character. My goodness, why did I do that? We're thinking about Wesley's character, right? And what kind of guy he is. From this, I can tell he's very friendly, and he is interested in history. He thinks it's important to know about the past. At the NAACP office, February 1960. After work, Wesley spent long evenings at the NAACP office. Do you guys notice how I'm reading this? I'm not saying NAACP. This organization exists today, and they're really important. But when you say this organization's acronym, you say NAACP. CP. So one night he was visited by a group of students who were excited about what was happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. Young Black people there had staged a sit-in at a lunch counter in a local store. They had refused to leave until they were served. So it's a form of nonviolent protest. You go to a restaurant that you're not allowed to go to, and you sit there and you say, I don't care what color I am, you need to serve me lunch, and I'm not moving until it happens. The students standing in front of Wesley wanted to do the same thing at the department stores on Broughton Street, but they needed a leader. Wesley remembered how his grandma had been treated at Levy's, and he agreed to help. But first, the students had to be trained. They had to protest without ever using violence, even if the other side did. If they were attacked and they fought back, Wesley told them, their cause would be lost. Now, this sounds a lot like Martin Luther King Jr., doesn't it? This nonviolent protest. Oops, my goodness, I always do that. So basically, Wesley's saying, okay, I'll be your leader, which tells me something about his character. They wanted him to be a leader, so people trusted him. They thought he was smart. They thought he was a good leader. And he agreed, but he said, as long as you promise not to use violence. So that tells me something else about him. It tells me that he wanted to do things like Martin Luther King Jr. the right way. He knew that fighting evil with more evil was not the answer. Here's his poster, the sit-in strategy. Dress neatly, enter together, sit together, order politely, do not react to insults, leave together. That's how they were going to do their sit-in. Yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to make if I keep commenting, it's going to make this video long. You guys are like, don't do it, Miss Hanko, don't do it. I just love this era in our history. I don't love it. I hate it, but I think it's just so interesting. And people need to pay attention to this stuff so that we can learn from it, right? Just like Wesley says. So here they are at the lunch counter doing their sit-in. These two waitress ladies are like, what you doing here, right? Levy's lunch counter. After weeks of training, small groups of students made their way downtown, entered the big stores along Broughton Street, and sat down at the lunch counters. The stores refused to serve them. At Levy's, the manager called the police, who had arrested the students for breaking the city's segregation laws. So they got arrested for just trying to eat lunch in a place that they weren't allowed to because of the color of their skin. Oh, I forgot to look at the questions, didn't I? Let's go look at that before we read. Why did people throw their charge cards into a pile during Wesley's meeting? So the answer to that question is going to be on this page anyway. Wesley called a mass meeting, the next Sunday at the Bolton Street Baptist Church. People filled the pews and balconies. Wesley opened the meeting with a hymn. All the voices singing together made a thunderous sound, and the mighty noise made people think that perhaps working together they could really make something happen. Wesley spoke about the arrest of the young people at Levy's. He said that things had to change, and he asked if people were ready to fight for their rights. Someone shouted, "I'll never shop at that store again." Then someone in the balcony threw down a Levy's charge card. Soon, everyone was tossing charge cards into a big pile in the church. So them throwing their charge cards into the pile was symbolic of them saying, we're going to refuse to go to that store ever again, and they're going to lose our business. And then that business is going to lose money because they don't have as many customers. That is what we called a boycott earlier when we talked about vocabulary. How does the illustration help the reader understand what a boycott is? How does the text help the reader understand what a boycott is? So the heading is, the boycott begins March 17th, 1960. The next morning, Wesley led a group downtown. They carried baskets full of charge cards. At Levy's, Wesley and his group dumped the baskets of charge cards onto the sidewalk. Then Wesley announced that no Black people would shop at any store on Broughton Street until they were treated equally. The Great Savannah Boycott had begun. This is in Savannah, Georgia, remember. And so we're learning about boycott. And the picture is showing them dumping out their charge cards in front of the store. And you can kind of see people to the side just watching them. So one thing I learned about what a boycott is they're not fighting, right? They're not attacking and breaking windows and stuff. All they're doing is peacefully dumping out these cards onto the sidewalk. The text helps me understand when it says, No Black people would shop at any store until they were treated equally. That helps me understand what a boycott is, because I know that they're refusing to give business to someone who is not being fair. The next page, we're going to think about how do we think the author feels about the protesters, and what do we think the word jeered means as it's used on page 230. Wesley and members of the picket lines is the heading. Wesley and members of the NAACP organized a picket line every day in front of levees. White people yelled and jeered at the protesters and tried to force them off the sidewalk, but day after day the protesters returned. So we get that white people yelled and jeered at the protesters. So what do we think jeered means? Maybe like mocked, made fun of, shouted insults to. One day, a large, burly white man punched one of the demonstrators in the face and broke his jaw. Just some guy that was out in front of on the sidewalk holding up a sign. And he got punched and broke his jaw. But everyone remembered what Wesley had taught them. So instead of fighting this guy, they didn't yell or fight back, no matter how much they wanted to. Imagine seeing your friend get punched and injured pretty badly and having to do nothing. But that was the right decision. That was what Wesley had taught them to do. Because if they had fought back, they would be made to look bad. Wesley organized other protests. There were kneel-ins at the white churches on Sundays and wade-ins at the all-white beach at Tebee. Wesley wanted to end segregation everywhere in Savannah, in libraries, theaters, public pools, beaches, and restrooms, as well as lunch counters. Isn't that crazy that they couldn't go to the same beach? Like, that's so odd. Talking about peaceful change. Large meetings were held every Sunday at different churches. Protesters talked about their activities. Some gave fiery speeches. The meetings became so popular that no church was big enough to hold everyone who wanted to get in. For a year and a half, no one from the Black community shopped on Broughton Street. Wesley walked down the street and started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going out of business signs. The white store owners couldn't stay in business without Black customers. When he delivered mail to white people, Wesley told them how much he loved Savannah. He wanted the city to be a better place for everyone. And they respected Wesley. They saw how peaceful and committed to change the protesters were. Little by little, more and more white people began to sympathize with the protesters. So they started to agree with them. And I don't think they would have changed their minds if the protesters were being violent. So how do we think the author feels about the protesters? I think that the author respects them and thinks they're doing the right thing. I think that last sentence, more and more white people began to sympathize with the protesters because of how peaceful they were being. I think that the author believes that these protests were what caused people to change. And without them, it wouldn't have happened, right? Let's go to the last page. How does Wesley fulfill his grandma's vision? And what does the quote on page 233, paragraph 2, tell the reader about Wesley? So, desegregation without violence. White people in the community who supported Wesley asked what they could do to end segregation and stop the boycott. Together, leaders from the white and Black communities worked out a plan. Each evening after delivering the mail, Wesley organized a group of students to sit in a different kind of business or facility the next day. The theaters would be first, then the restaurants, then the library, and down the line until every business had been desegregated, which means the end of segregation. Sometimes angry crowds would gather, or white people would leave in protest when the Black students arrived. But most of the white and Black leaders stuck together. The mayor made sure that all the signs marking separate facilities for Blacks and whites at City Hall, the courthouse, the health department, and the hospital were taken down. City officials took the segregation laws off the books, which means they ended those laws. Unlike desegregation efforts in other cities and towns in the South, there was very little violence in Savannah. So Savannah is kind of special thanks to Wesley because this was all done with very little violence and fighting. Justice delivered. On a Sunday in September 1961, Wesley greeted the hundreds of people who arrived at a downtown Savannah church. Inside, their voices joined together to sing out, "We are soldiers in God's army." When the song ended, Wesley stood in front of the crowd. He saw his mother sitting in the front row. He saw students who had been arrested. He saw faces beaming with pride. Then he announced in a loud, clear voice, "We have triumphed." Savannah was the first southern city in the United States to declare all its citizens equal, 3 years before the Federal Civil Rights Act made all segregation illegal. People, both black and white, saw Wesley as Savannah's hero. He had kept the protests disciplined and peaceful, even in face of the violence. Mostly, he would say, I was just doing what every black American should be doing. Wesley Wallace Law delivered more than just the mail to the citizens of Savannah. He delivered justice, too. His grandma's prayers had been answered. So how does he answer his grandma's prayers? That's the first one. Remember at the beginning of the book, she talked about she wanted him to be a leader, to change the things that were unjust. And that's exactly what he did. He became a leader. He caused change to happen and ended segregation in Savannah, Georgia, and fulfilled her vision. The quote on page 233 in paragraph 2, it is down here. It says, again, I was just doing what every black American should be doing. What does that tell you about Wesley? It tells me that he's humble, he's modest, he's not bragging, he's not saying, I'm so great, I'm the hero, yay. He is just saying, you know what? I was just doing what was right. That's kind of a really powerful thing. Like, everybody should be doing what's right, so I'm not special. And yeah, pretty awesome. So what you guys are going to do now is you are going to go ahead and open the slideshow that you have in underneath your reading assignments for the week. And the slideshow looks exactly like this one. And remember, you're going to go ahead and you're going to answer the questions down here in the speaker notes. You just click here, type number 1, and then type your answer. You're going to go through and answer all those questions, and then you are going to turn that in, okay? I hope you guys are enjoying learning about this stuff.